Joel?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll give just a moment. We've got a lot of participants still joining, so we'll get started in just a few seconds. Okay, so we're here today for our webinar on scam liability for broker dealers. We're going to talk about trends, FINRA expectations, as well as best practices. We've got a great group here to talk through it. From Bressler, myself, Joel Everest, here in Birmingham, Alabama, as well as Sean Coughlin up in New York, and Taylor Bandy down at Fort Lauderdale. All of us focus our practices on defending financial institutions as well as their employees in court and arbitration, as well as in front of regulators. And we, along with the rest of the country, have been seeing these scam issues pop up more and more in recent years. And our special guest today, who are going to offer what I think is a really interesting perspective on these issues and an important perspective on these issues. We have Brooks Brown from FINRA. He's a senior director with FINRA and oversees the investigative side of the vulnerable adults and seniors team, as well as the high risk representative investigative team. He's been with FINRA since 2001, as well as Jennifer Parisi. She's an assistant United States attorney for the Middle District of Florida down in Tampa. She's been there since 2010, and she also focuses on these issues. She's a member of the economic crime section and focuses on elder fraud cases. She's also been an elder justice coordinator since 2018. So very excited to have them on board and hear their perspective today. And with that, we're going to kick it right off, and I'm going to turn it over to Taylor to get us started. I'm going to even skip over the overview. Taylor, do you want to just get started on the scope of fraudulent scams?
Yes, thanks, Joel. So as Joel said, I'm going to start it out giving you guys kind of an overview of the scope and the different types of fraudulent exams that have been prevalent the past 2 years. So the FBI has an Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is known as IC3 for short, and it is a central intake point for victims to report fraud. Then the IC3 takes these complaints, shares it with different FBI field offices, local law enforcement, the DOJ's Elder Fraud Initiative, and other regulatory agencies for further investigation or action as appropriate. Every day, the IC3 receives thousands of complaints, reporting a wide variety of fraudulent schemes, and many of them are targeting seniors. So after the IC3 receives these complaints, they're analyzed and aggregated to identify different trends that are developing and to allow different agencies as well as financial institutions to come up with different strategies to develop and combat these schemes to protect victims, especially elder victims, from loss. So starting out with the past two IC3 reports, each year they come out with an annual report specifically related to elder adults that shows the trends and the data points. In 2022, the total losses reported to the IC3 by elderly victims increased 84%. And that led to a total of 3.1 billion losses just for elder victims. There were more than 88,000 victims. And when I'm saying elder adults, they consider that to be any adults 60 and over. The three most common types of scams were tech and support scams, which that had approximately 18,000 complaints. The second was non-payment and non-delivery scams with 8,000 victims. And then the third was a personal data breach. So kind of as a whole, the trends they saw in 2022, the monetary losses related to investment fraud went up went up nearly 300%, which was more than any other kind of fraud. So on the next slide, I will go into the financial losses. So as I mentioned, the investment fraud reported for older adults went up over 300%. And that was largely due to the rise in cryptocurrency investment scams. Basically across any kind of scam that was tracked by the IC3 that involved some kind of cryptocurrency element to it, those related losses increased by 350%. So as you can see on this slide, the three scams with the largest financial losses, first being the investment scams at nearly $1 billion. Tech support came in second, and then business email compromise scams came in third, which it breaks it down into two components, one being losses related to the business, and then the other being personal losses. In 2022, the average loss per victim, regardless of the fraudulent scheme, was $35,000. However, more than 5,000 of the elder victims lost more than $100,000. So unfortunately, in 2023, we continued to see an upward trend in losses and victims. The losses reported to the IC3 showed that the losses for elder adults topped nearly 3.4 billion. So that's an extra 3 million than the year before. And there was also a 14% increase in complaints filed. But it's important to note that not every complaint includes age data. So out of the 880,000 complaints that were received last year, only about half of them included the data, age data. So it's estimated that this number is likely even higher. More than 100,000 reports were received specifically, including data related to elder victims. And unsurprisingly, probably to many, Florida has the second highest volume of cases in the country, which is likely due to the large retirement community here. In 2023, the three most common scams were tech support, personal data breach, and then confidence and romance scams, which in 2023, there was a large rise in the romance scams, which we will talk about a little bit later in the presentation. For 2023, the three scams with the highest financial losses were the same as 2022. There you'll see on the screen that investment, the dollar amount increased, as we discussed earlier, that there was a trend in a rising trend. Tech support and business email compromise, the losses stayed around the same. And in 2023, the loss per victim was a little less at $34,000, but that was because there was the increase in victims.
Thanks, Taylor. I did want to mention too, there's a Q&A function for our participants. So feel free to type in your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to those live here during the webinar. And if not, we can always follow up with you after and answer anything. So with that, Jennifer, do you want to talk about these common scams that we're seeing?
Yes, and I know I'm speaking to an educated audience, so you all have probably already heard of these different types of scams, but just to make sure we're on the same page, and these are, at least according to one resource, the top 5 financial scams targeting older adults. They're certainly the top 5 things that we're seeing in the Middle District of Florida with respect to victims reporting crime and with respect to investigating and prosecuting crime. So first, the most common fraud scheme is government impersonation scams. And this is anything from your social security number has been compromised, there's a warrant out for your arrest, We represent Medicare, we represent HHS with respect to victims. It is basically anything fraudsters could impersonate, they are impersonating, and they're using that impersonation to get seniors to part with their money. Second, we have sweepstakes and lottery scams. I am constantly baffled by how so many people fall subject to the Jamaican lottery scheme when Jamaica doesn't have a lottery and they have never played the Jamaican lottery. But it's still a very common fraud scheme. We're still seeing the Publishers Clearinghouse scheme and any other sort of sweepstakes where a senior is told that they have won a bunch of money and they just need to pay the taxes and fees. I had one particularly hard case recently where my victim was a vulnerable victim suffering from dementia. So he remembered that he had won the Jamaican lottery, but forgot that he had paid the taxes and fees, and actually paid these taxes and fees like 10 or 11 times to a total loss of about $500,000 because he just kept paying. He was so excited that he had won, and he forgot that he had actually paid these taxes. And then we see robocalls and phone scams. And that's basically a catch-all for any other type of impersonation. So we have Amazon, it's an Amazon package. Unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of cases now where people are impersonating financial institutions. So I have a case right now involving Charles Schwab, Citibank. All of the financial institutions on this webinar are probably fraud victims themselves, because people know that that's a good way to get senior citizens to part with their money. They want to trust their financial institution. They're building on that trust that you all have already gotten with the customer, and they're exploiting that trust. Then we see computer tech support scams, and that's where most commonly there's a pop-up on a senior's computer that says it's infected with a virus. Seniors, not the most computer apt persons, believe that that's true and are willing to part with their money initially for software to fix the virus or other problem with the computer, but ultimately they give remote ownership to their computer, and then they end up giving access to their bank accounts and other accounts. And then we see grandparent scams, and this is when the fraudsters are saying that a grandchild is under arrest, having some medical ailment in some foreign country and needs help, and they'll say grandma or grandpa, and then the grandma understandably responds with, oh, is it Jeremy, for example? Well, then the fraudster just pretends to be Jeremy and says whatever grandma wants to hear to convince grandma to part with her money.
I actually had that happen to my in-laws, and but for the fact that my father-in-law reached out to me and asked me to get involved and gave me the telephone numbers and told me the name of the jail that his nephew supposedly was in. And then I reached out to the jail and realized he wasn't there. My father-in-law would have sent away $20,000 to these fraudsters. And he's a retired lawyer.
It seems these fraudsters, and one of the things that I didn't understand when I first started doing these cases, is that they're professionals. We're not talking a single guy behind a computer. We're talking entire boiler rooms, generally in foreign countries, of people trying to come up with the best ways to get seniors to part with their money. Next slide.
Moving forward, Jennifer, yep.
So this is just a longer list of some of the scams. And as you can see here, the fraudsters impersonate everything they can to get money. Medicare, Amazon, home repair, charities, shopping networks. They offer work from home to try to get senior citizens to become money mules. And then also romance scams. Unfortunately, as we can sort of anticipate, when we have widows or widowers, for example, going online, looking for love, they really want to believe that the person on the other end that says that they're in love with them is a real person. Even if they haven't met the person in person or even virtually, they want to believe it's true, and they are very willing to then spend money for whatever maladies befall that person. Most commonly, it's someone who's on an oil rig, who doesn't have access to his money, or is stuck in customs. Reasons you'd want to help a romantic interest, if only it was true.
Hey, Jennifer, we had a question come in asking about specific to grandparent scams, the use of AI to imitate a family member's voice. Is that's a concept I've heard of? Is that something we're actually seeing in real life?
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm guessing it's just because we're a little bit behind in terms of learning what's going on. What's so hard about all of these different schemes is that no one wants to raise their hand right away and say, I've been a victim and let me tell you what happened. So we find that there's a little bit of a lag time, particularly with these newer scams, with people even wanting to be comfortable enough to report it. I'm certain, I mean, in my experience prosecuting and investigating these cases, if it's possible, the fraudsters are exploiting it. So I know they're using AI already in terms of mining data about folks, and I'm certain that voices are already happening, if not soon.
Joel, I would just add from the broker dealer perspective, we've not seen that, kind of voice deep fake infiltrating in the cause work that we're doing just yet. But as Jennifer said, I think it's either just not being reported to us yet. We're just another in a long line of reporting avenues for investors. Or it just hasn't filtered to impact the broker dealer space just yet. But it's clear that it's begun. It began several years ago, and it's just getting more and more sophisticated every day.
And as we talk about AI and other sophisticated ways that fraudsters out there try and scam people out of money, it's important to look at two areas. So your traditional broker dealers, banks, and also the growing crypto market. And one of the things that fraudsters are now doing, they're phishing. They're sending out something that purportedly on texts comes from, names we all know, whether it's Pershing, Fidelity, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America. And it's really not from any of those institutions at all. But what it is it's a notification that you need to contact and reply to this message you got because your funds, have been compromised. And what they're trying to do is get people to turn around and connect and pretend like they are corporate security for those institutions and ask you then to move your money from your existing account because it's been compromised into this new account. And everything is designed, and if you look at the pictures they send you, it purports to be, a brokerage account that you're familiar with, whether it's an online view of that account or a paper view of that account. And so the attempt is really to try and get you to move your money or to send the account statement you have to them so they can see it and mimic it and then take control over it and try and essentially pretend that you're the FA for you. So that's one aspect that's out there. And most of these large financial services firms are constantly monitoring and looking to see if this is going on. They spend billions of dollars trying to prevent this, but it happens. The more important one, and I think that's a harder one to defend or to deal with, are smaller investment advisor companies that are essentially set up and almost promise to do the same thing, a la the old boiler rooms that used to exist. You basically get encouraged to invest in stocks you don't know, similar to the Robinhood app, but it's a fake app. It doesn't exist. You're just giving your money away to the fraudster, and the fraudster is encouraging you to invest more and more. At the same time, we have fake crypto wallet companies. We have companies that are out there. The fraudsters basically mimic real crypto companies. Oftentimes, these are crypto companies in parts of the world where US citizens are not allowed to invest. So if the person goes online and looks for it, it looks real and legit. Now, they might not see the fact that you're not allowed to invest in there, but they go online, they invest their hard-earned funds, and they're promised certain returns. And the returns, I think everybody listening to this would all say, well, that's too good to be true. There's no way somebody would do that. But remember, the average investor out there has only heard about this tremendous rise in the value of crypto assets. And nobody's really heard, and they've also heard in some ways about the volatility, certainly during the year 2022 and 23 of crypto assets. So they know there's some risks to it, but mostly they've heard about the increases. And so what happens is, generally, there's an intermediary. So the money will go from, whatever bank it's at into Coinbase or another legitimate asset that can set up a wallet for somebody. And then it's transferred to another crypto dealer. That's the story that's being told. But it's that next transfer that occurs where it's really going to the fraudsters. And it's all done using the wallet ID that the fraudsters provide. And what the fraudster also does is they provide the fake website that looks and mimics like it's a real website. So the investor puts the money in. Initially, it's done $10,000, $20,000. And lo and behold, within 2 weeks, they go online and take a look, and it appears they have $35,000. So either they want to invest more, and they do this, or they get told that the only way they can get money out is because they're in a lock-in type program. They actually have to deposit additional funds. And smart people across our country and across the world turn around and deposit these additional funds. And it's just like giving it away. You'll never see it again, unfortunately. So this is the imposter financial broker dealer thing that our clients need to be wary of, people impostering them. But two, seniors, anybody who's vulnerable, we need to really make sure people understand, do they know where their funds are going before they send any money? So that's pretty much that. And I'm actually going to get to the very first code now. The first CLE code is Elder.
Thanks, Sean. And I wanted to jump in real quick because we had a comment come in through the question channel. One of our participants, her firm actually has seen the AI issue we were talking about. She commented that it was a celebrity romance scam. They actually used deep fake video technology that made it appear that the individual was talking to Michael Douglas, the actor, in real time. So, sophisticated enough to fool that individual. They reported it to the State Securities Commission, who let them know that they'd seen a similar matter, also deepfake video, with another celebrity, Alexander Skarsgård. So that's at least 2 instances of AI actually hitting, kind of the real world, not just theoretical.
Well, and let me add to that. I thought the question was specific to grandparent scams where I haven't seen AI yet, but on romance scams, there's a ton of AI. We even had a case where someone was impersonating a congressman. And honestly, it baffles me that this elderly person thought she was actually dating a congressman who was like 40 years younger. But the congressman's office got complaints when she was losing money. And obviously then they referred it to us and we were able to somewhat stop the bleed. Unfortunately, sometimes that's all we can do because it's so difficult to identify where the money is ultimately going. I have a ton of cases right now where people are taking money out of, for instance, their Charles Schwab account and actually giving to the fraudsters in gold. Well, then it's picked up by a money mule, and obviously it's pretty hard. The gold's melted down, and it's pretty hard to ever get anything back to the victim.
Somebody just asked about the CLE codes. So at the end of this presentation, everybody who participates will be sent an email so you can get your CLE credit, and you're going to need to put on the very first code that's up on the screen right now, Elder, and the next code that we give you. And that way you can email that back to us and you'll wind up getting CLE credit for whatever jurisdiction you're in.
We're going to move on to prosecuting fraud. Jennifer, do you want to give us your expertise there? Or Sean, you may have some questions.
Yeah, so, what I actually thought we'd kind of do here is work this out with both Jennifer and Brooks and really try and get the perspective and the conversation going from both of them, so that we can all share some of our insights. And to get started, really, in terms of victims, right? From a law enforcement perspective, Jennifer, and from FINRA, why don't we talk about what you think financial institutions, whether they're brokers, bankers, investment advisors, what should they do to assist those who have already been victims of financial scams? Why don't I start with you, Brooks, because Jennifer's been speaking and we haven't heard a lot from you yet.
Sure. I would just, one thing I wanted to focus on, and you'll see, those of you tuning in, you can see the links provided on the slide that features me. We put out what we're calling a threat intelligence product recently. I believe it was in May that this particular product was put out, and it was really authored by our vulnerable adults and seniors team at FINRA, and it focuses on elderly financial exploitation, and it highlights many of the current concerns and issues that we're seeing here. But I think there are a couple of messages here that are really important takeaways that I think are often overlooked at member firms that we speak with, and I'm referring specifically to broker dealers, although I think there's a lot in common with the investment advisory space as well. The first focuses on education, and the second is really about how you communicate with the victim when you first caught wind of the situation. But first, for education, I think one of the most important takeaways from the product we put out is a takeaway from a recent FINRA Foundation study that was done, and that's the importance of educational intervention, and not just with elder investors. It's extremely important there, but also your staff, your firm employees, your frontline, either customer-facing individuals, salespeople, or frontline supervisors. With investors, the key takeaway that I had from the study was around online educational interventions and how it can really be effective at reducing susceptibility to investment fraud. And what the study found, in short, was that if the elder investors who got that online educational piece or intervention, when they received it, shortly after they got that piece or that video that was educating about investment scams, they basically displayed a lower willingness to invest in a fraudulent investment scheme when it was presented to them, when it was pitched, using the same techniques used by these fraudsters. And so that's obviously kind of very revealing, and I think important for us to take away. But also a message or an important element of that was those interventions need to be persistent. Within the same study, it showed that these positive effects lasted for several months, but they decay over time, as you might expect. And so 6 months after that additional intervention, those same individuals were no better at identifying a fraudulent scheme than anyone else. And so what that points to is just the need for regular educational interventions with that portion of your customer base. And it was a similar takeaway for firm employees. Member firms report to us that there's a consistent increase in elder financial exploitation situations shortly after they've received training regarding red flags and what to look out for. But then they also say those reports tend to fall off over time, and then they increase again after they receive training. Again, highlights the importance of these educational interventions being persistent and consistent. Couple of examples that we've seen firms are doing. They've definitely increased the amount of scam and fraud article and video awareness that they're providing to clients, and they're doing it on a regular basis. And they're hosting periodic educational seminars that include not just their clients, their elderly clients, but also their brokers and potentially supervisors. and they're engaging, third-party experts to assist with that, whether it be the FBI, AARP, or law enforcement. I'll stop there. I want to give Jennifer time, but there are a couple of other key takeaways from the piece that we put out that I'm sure we'll get to shortly.
And Jennifer, what can you opine about what financial institutions can do to assist with victims of fraud?
Well, first off, we're so grateful for recent efforts of financial institutions. It used to be the case when I started doing these cases in 2017 and 2018 that the financial institutions were more on the protect their customer, and so didn't want to call law enforcement, for instance, if the customer said, this is really how I want to spend their money. So we've seen a big change in terms of, actually, I would say about half the cases we get now come from financial institutions who are talking to their clients who, especially with these cryptocurrency schemes, the person will come in and they will say, I want to move all my money into crypto, but doesn't know anything about where they're moving their money, why they're moving their money, how this is all going to work. And it's pretty apparent that they're a fraud victim as opposed to a knowing investor. One of the things that I want to emphasize, though, to everyone is that because these fraudsters build such a relationship with the people, by the time you all intervene, the victims trust the fraudsters more than they'll trust the financial institutions or anyone else. And so everyone wants to believe they're smarter than the average bear. So there's no possibility that they've fallen victim of a fraud scheme. So they react really poorly to someone just saying, hey, I think you're being defrauded. They react better to questions. Well, did they show you the warrant when they said there was a warrant out for the arrest? Did you meet this girlfriend in person? Did you confirm with the financial institution that it was really the financial institution reaching out? Or, as Brooke says, with respect to videos, with respect to pamphlets, people react better when they see they're not the only person that's falling victim to a scheme. We're always grateful when we get the information from financial institutions, when we can freeze the money, stop the transfers, give us a little bit of time to do seizure warrants if that's necessary, because as we all know, once that money goes a couple steps beyond victim, we're not getting it back. And then certainly to the extent that you can help with documentation on the victim end and on the financial institution end, whether that be account numbers, wallet IDs, IP addresses, that's going to help us later in terms of trying to investigate and prosecute the fraud.
Thank you. Now,
Hey,
Brooke,
Jennifer, one of the questions that came in over chat is when someone has been victimized, who to contact? Is there any preference from your perspective in terms of a federal authority or state authorities? Who's best to contact in that situation?
Well, and all of the federal and state authorities are working on this, but IC3 is the best sort of first repository. And that's what Taylor spent a lot of time talking about at the beginning. It's the easiest place. You just do an online report and then it will get funneled to either FBI, another federal agency, or local law enforcement to follow up.
and there's
It also allows us
scam
to make
trackers.
connections. I'm sorry, Sean.
There's also individual states have now started various scam trackers as well. So you can look to the state you're residing in or where this scam occurs in and check there. I know California's Department of Financial Protection and Innovation now has a crypto scam tracker. So that's a place to look at. Brooks, let's talk about education.
Sean, real quick, if I could just a quick comment on reporting. I want to echo what Jennifer said about really IC3 on the front end. Like, you've got a lot of reporting obligations. Obviously, if you're a broker dealer, you potentially have BSA obligations. You may want to, relative to individual states, you may want to report to Adult Protective Services. We would recommend that, obviously. But that FBI reporting is just so critical in terms of if money has already left the building, time is so much of the essence. And if you don't report it immediately, the chances are falling by the second that any of that money gets found.
Can you talk about what type of training broker-dealer clients should be offering their employees to look out for these potential scams, Brooks?
Training, I think just in terms of like the sort of webinar that's being put on here, I think covers a lot of the same concepts and topics that you'd want to home in on with your staff. To me, and maybe this is an opportunity to kind of focus on one of the other big takeaways I have from some of these FINRA resources that we've been putting together. I think training about the conversation with a potential victim is critical. And I think that should really take place at multiple levels, whether it's the client-facing representative or broker or advisor or a supervisor that may be, as part of a senior compliance team that's reaching out to these individuals in response to red flags. I think just the tenor and the approach to that conversation is so important. As Jennifer said, these folks already trust the scammers likely more than they would trust their own broker. That's why they're calling in now to move their money to them. And we put on a couple of workshops earlier this year focused on communications with elderly investors and potential victims, and it was led by Peter Lichtenberg, who is a fairly prominent psychologist in the field of gerontology. And there were several takeaways that we had from that session. And when you're working with an individual that's vulnerable, that vulnerability could arise from a number of different circumstances in their life, whether it's just being, their emotional state, being lonely or depression for something that's happening in their life, or it could be obviously from mental health. But that vulnerability makes conversations about their money that much more difficult. And so, the approach to that conversation, it's been demonstrated that when you come in with a kind of victim blaming approach, that the anxiety and the anger and the distrust that's going to, rise up within that individual is going to take over the conversation. So you want to come in from a position of, respect, have a person-centered principle to the interview, and change the conversation from a transactional one to a learning conversation. Like, you're there to understand what's happening. And I think one of the most significant recommendations from the experts here is the people with this responsibility in your firms should have a script. They should be prepared. They should be trained on how these conversations can unfold. And having a script that really sets the table for partnership, where we, the firm, we're here to learn about what's happening with you, and we want to partner with you to understand what this transaction might mean for you. We're going to ask questions that kind of illustrate, we're going to lower the barriers. Like, have you heard about some of these scams, like romance scams or the grandparent scams? Has anyone ever experienced any of these scams? Oh, they did. What happened? How was it resolved? Those are there are tools that you can give folks who are interacting with these potential victims that can really raise the likelihood that these conversations are successful, and that the barriers are lowered and the trust level comes back to the firm as opposed to the scammers. There's a lot of takeaways that we had from that. If Sean, I would offer, if your group or anyone calling in would like me to share some additional takeaways and ideas that we took from the workshops that we put on after this webinar, I'd be happy to.
That sounds great. Thinking about just what you're talking about, I was wondering, Jennifer, if you could sort of go over some of the anti-money laundering cryptocurrency red flags that are out there for brokerage firms, banks, financial advisors to be aware of.
Well, frankly, we're seeing that some of the biggest red flags is that senior citizens who weren't investing in cryptocurrency suddenly want to transfer a bunch of money into cryptocurrency. It's a group that isn't doing regular investing with cryptocurrency as much. So anytime we start to hear about a senior talking about cryptocurrency, the red flags are not understanding what the money is going to, not knowing even which exchange, Sometimes these exchange names that people are given seem pretty apparently fraudulent. They'll be misspelled Coinbase, for example, with Coyne. And so just sort of taking the time, as Brooks is saying, to talk to the investor, to learn from them. Okay, well, what are you trying to do with your money? And what is the plan? And are we sure that this is legitimate?
Sean, I would just add, kind of echo some of what Jennifer said. From a general perspective, your firm's AML program and your firm's general supervisory approach is going to be to identify transactions or money movements that are unusual, right? That are not consistent with the customer's history, not consistent with their financial situation, or not consistent with their known investment profile. So in the context of elder fraud and scam liability, we're looking at red flag, we're looking at the ability to flag money movements that are just generally unusual, or that the customer can't explain in a way that makes sense, relative to their situation. And so whether that's raising the idea to move money to a cryptocurrency exchange, or if it's for some other reason, it's really just, I think going back to training, ensuring that frontline employees and supervisors are really kind of understanding what does unusual mean, and how, what lenses should you look through to identify something that could be unusual or something that could be a red flag. And those kind of training and educational interventions are extremely productive. And just like to echo what Jennifer said, in a recent example we had in one of our cases, there are situations where, it's not even a question about where the money is going. The investor is here telling you that, here, I want to wire, $75,000 out of my account to a cryptocurrency exchange. Even give it a name, the Global Digital Currency Exchange, which, ultimately was fraudulent. This customer that I'm speaking of, over a period of 2 weeks, ended up wiring out $1.4 million. The broker, every step along the way, said, are you sure you want to do this? This doesn't make sense. Are you sure that this is a good idea? And the customers, telling him, don't worry, I'm praying to God every day. We feel good about this. There's going to be good returns, etc. The customer had no history of third-party transfers before that. The customer was clearly saying where the money was going, hallmarks of the current crypto scam that's prevalent. There was no, hold to put on the account pursuant to 2165, which could have been employed. That's a FINRA rule that was put in place over the last few years. And there was no escalation to the firm's elder fraud, elder focused unit. So, I mean, that's just an example of, that broker probably didn't get the appropriate preparation and training, in terms of, what do I do when I'm confronted with these red flags?
What about those same red flags with younger people, though, not elders? Right? You don't have 2165 for somebody who's 35 years old, who could be duped by the same romance scam or the same crypto scam.
No doubt. I mean, I would say that very similar principles would apply from a supervisory approach. As the broker dealer or as the financial institution, it's our job to establish a financial profile for our customer, have an understanding of what the intended investment strategy will be, or what their use for the account will be, establish that foundation, and then track it going forward, understand what would be unusual for that individual, so that you'd be able to identify, even if it's a 45-year-old employed person with a normal financial situation, what would be unusual for this person.
And Brooks, I'll push back a little bit as the defense lawyer here. In the situation you just laid out, where the customer was adamant, I know what I'm doing, I want to do this.
Oh, no doubt.
Like what you mentioned, the advisor needing better training in that situation, what more should the advisor have done? What could the advisor have done?
And maybe look, I'm speculating here to some extent. Maybe the training was fine. I didn't tell that story to suggest that there's, you know, liability or that there's actionable misconduct that took place. What I'm suggesting is that's just an example of where educational and training interventions, especially for a case like this that was just so blatant and obvious, I think if you're not doing that already, we need to be, because those are the kind of things that can, if not prevent, that can at least mitigate the losses when these situations start to unfold.
And this potentially ties into one of the questions that came in through the chat a minute ago. Someone's wondering about the trusted contact rule and you know, how does that kind of come into play in these types of situations? Is there an obligation to reach out to a trusted contact? Is that part of the front end, you know, before the scam of trying to get a trusted contact on file? Can you speak to that for a little while?
Yeah, it just, in terms of the trusted contact requirement, and the timing of when a scam occurs, it just depends on when you're encountering this unusual activity and the red flags. If you have a trusted contact on file, yes, to directly answer that question, yes, no doubt that should be, in my mind, that should be part of your escalation and red flag response procedures. That would be one of the first steps. Talk to a trusted contact, a separate party from the investor to try to understand what's happening, and maybe, you know, engage in intervention through that avenue. If you don't have a trusted contact at that point, then I think, you know, I'm not going to go through what the rule requires here. I think your firms on the line probably understand what's required in terms of obtaining the trusted contact. But if you don't have the trusted contact on file already, then I think you would go through your normal processes for escalation.
And in terms of this outreach, there are elder justice coordinators in every district. There's also someone tasked with FBI, with Postal Inspection Service in every district for outreach. And these folks, in some cases, like the FBI case, it's a mostly full-time job. So they are definitely willing to speak to whatever group of brokers or direct investors or senior citizens and provide more of this communication piece.
Okay, so we're now talking about, we've got suspected fraud. What should the financial institution do when they believe fraudulent activities occurring? And I thought both Jennifer and Brooks really laid it out very well, in that the fraudsters often believe, the person being scammed often believes the fraudsters more than they believe the institution. So really the right thing to do is to turn around and start asking questions of your client about why they are moving this money. And the more you ask questions, you're not making a blame. And that's the important thing, because nobody wants to be blamed and people don't want to be feeling like they're a victim. But if you ask the right questions and start probing as to why money's being moved, you can get people to realize for themselves that they are potentially getting themselves involved in something at a time where they can stop, at a time where they can work with the firms to potentially continue the scam in a way to get some money back, all right? Where, you know, they can reach out because it's an ongoing scam and use the firm's asset recovery teams to see if they can't trace where the money's gone. And, you know, potentially funds might still be there. So something can be done to try and get those funds back. And I thought, Brooks, that in your threat intelligence product, you did a nice job on page 3 of 5 of laying out some awareness and prevention section.
It's a great point, Sean. Like questions like, you know, this sounds like an important financial decision for you. Did you talk about this or get input from anyone else, any of your friends or family? And then, you know, if if they latch onto that, you know, you can find out, oh, okay, who gave you input? What advice did they give you? You could ask a question like, is this transaction similar to previous decisions that you've made, or do you think it's unusual? Just a lot of questions that, again, establishing a level of trust that hopefully can counteract the other side of this equation, and then where you can learn more, potentially, hopefully, learn more about what happened. Like those kind of partnership developing questions are extremely important.
Joel, do you want to bring up the question that we got for Brooks about what to do for clients under the age of 21, under the age of 65? Did you see that?
Yeah, just without 2165 coming into play for age or other reasons. What's a FINRA member to do to protect itself for those types of customers?
I mean, I think I touched on this earlier. I think your money laundering procedures are probably the best place to build some of this out. And I think it's all around identification of red flags of not just a particular type of scheme like manipulative trading or suspicious money movements necessarily, but really anything that could implicate criminal misconduct. And it could be suspicious money movements. That's likely where a lot of that kind of procedure will focus. But I think, you know, if you make it a little bit more age agnostic, then you've got a holistic approach to identifying transactions or movements that would potentially be, you know, unusual, whether it be moving money out to a first party bank account where it's a significant amount of funds and there's not a lot of logic or reason behind it, and then, you know, having that conversation, or if it's moving the money out to a third party. I think a big part of a broker dealer and a financial institution's obligations here is not just having a red flags policy that covers these things, but having a robust escalation policy. And that's where we see, frankly, a lot of firms fall down on this, and you know, the investigations that we're involved in is that, you know, things are recognized at one point or another along the way, whether it be at the broker level or maybe a frontline supervisor, but the escalation just doesn't happen the way it needs to. And you know, you've got to have a consistent playbook that can be followed time and time again when these sorts of red flags are encountered. And there needs to be, you know, frankly, there needs to be training and communication around it that's robust and consistent. To my earlier point, just periodic, regular educational interventions. The same applies for folks who are dealing with customers every day, especially when they're more on the sales side. They need to be reminded of these types of red flags and things that, you know, the types of scams that are out there and what they should be looking for. And I think, you know, even if you're designing a broader red flags identification process, which is great, you definitely still want to contemplate the elder financial exploitation element within there, because you're going to want to have greater sensitivity to the red flags of your elder client base.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Before we I'm going to skip ahead and go ahead before we get lost in the shuffle. The second CLE code is the word scam. So go ahead and mark that down. CLE code 2 is scam. And then Taylor, do you want to talk a little bit on effective practices here?
Yes. So we covered some of them already throughout the presentation, whether that be training, encouraging the use of trusted contact person forms. So I won't go into those too much in detail since they've already been covered. But another really good tool that financial institutions can use is the majority of states by now have enacted financial exploitation statutes. It varies among the states, but we're seeing the majority of them to include a disbursement and transaction hold provision, which that comports with FINRA Rule 2165, which allows the placement of a temporary hold on a disbursement of funds. It's really among the states on whether disbursements and transactions are included within those provisions. But what that does is it allows the financial institution to place a hold, stop that money from leaving if there's a reasonable expectation or reasonable suspicion that financial exploitation is occurring or has occurred in the account. So these statutes, like I mentioned, vary among states, but they do include safe harbors if the firm makes reports, if they make third-party disclosures, and if they place a hold. The statutes also vary how long a hold may be placed. The firms during that hold period are supposed to conduct an internal investigation to determine, whether the transaction should be allowed to occur or whether the disbursement should be processed. We're seeing a trend among states where some of these newer financial exploitation laws are then requiring the firms to report the internal investigation findings to the state securities division. So the transaction disbursement holds can be very helpful to firms. These financial exploitation statutes allow third-party disclosures. So currently, many of the states allow you to reach out to previously designated third parties. So that's, for example, trusted contact persons, if you suspect there is financial exploitation occurring. And we're starting to see a trend, and that we expect to continue, really, where financial exploitation laws are allowing disclosures to third parties reasonably associated with the accounts. So examples of that would be immediate family members, trustees, someone acting under a power of attorney. And so you can reach out to them. You don't want to go into too many details, but to say, we think there may be financial exploitation occurring in the account. As I mentioned, all of these statutes are different among the states. The reporting requirements are different, the hold requirements, who's considered an elder adult. Some states it's 60, other states it's 65 and up. So Bressler has a free resource online called the Bressler Senior Map. You can go to the Bressler Senior Map, you can click on any state, and it will provide you the relevant information. So we really encourage you to utilize financial exploitation statutes and to utilize the resources, since they all really vary among the states.
Taylor, if I could just add a little bit of commentary on the reporting obligations that firms have. And we see this in kind of our interactions with firms and investigations. It's just critical that hopefully firms don't approach this with a kind of check the box mentality, where we feel like just reporting the incident to IC3 or filing a SAR is going to be enough, and it'll get the issue where it needs to go, just as long as we get it reported. I would just say how the incident is reported is extremely important in terms of what authorities are able to do and how they're able to action the information that they get. Reporting, for example, if you file a SAR in response to an ongoing scheme that you're seeing impacting one of your clients, if they're elderly, you want to mark the elderly financial exploitation box in that SAR report. Otherwise, that information will not get filed and responded to in the same way within the FinCEN process as other matters that are marked that way. We already talked about notifying the FBI immediately, just in terms of ability to claw back funds. When it comes to APS reporting, I think we probably all know that can be pretty tricky. One of the issues that we see is that APS often wants to speak directly with the employee who had that direct contact with the client. And, firms in their process escalation and follow-up processes instead of connecting APS with that person that spoke directly to the client, they'll have them speak with someone in compliance. And that can really, while I understand the sentiment behind that, I think it can really reduce the effectiveness of the reporting and the information that's being conveyed to APS getting lost. And then just, we always tell firms to be careful about kind of the industry jargon and terminology that they use in APS reporting, because depending on the state, you may be dealing with folks who have just not as great an understanding of what these terms mean. And so things can easily get lost in translation. It's important to use really plain language in making those reports.
Thanks, Brooks. And we're really at time here. Anybody quick final thought?
I want to tell everyone that we have learned in our investigations that once someone is a fraud victim, their identities and information are actually more expensive to fraudsters. And so they're shared with other fraudsters. There are lists of prior victims, and so they're more likely to become victims. So the extent that you're trying to reach out to victims, it might make sense to have some sort of label for prior victims because they're more likely to be future victims.
That's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Brooks. Two of you especially for joining us today and offering up those perspectives.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Hey, it
you.
was nice to meet you, Brooks and Jennifer. I really appreciate your helping us out here.